My name is Nia. I am 32 years old and a single mother to an amazing 8-year-old boy named Jamal. At our family cookout last weekend, my son walked up to the grill and asked for a simple hamburger. My brother Marcus snatched the plate right out of his hands and announced to the entire backyard that burgers were only for kids with a bright future. He told everyone that with my son's reading delays, he only deserved a plain peanut butter sandwich. My mother Vivian and my white sister-in-law Chloe just looked at each other and nodded in agreement. I did not scream or cry or throw a fit. I quietly took my son by the hand and we walked away. At 11:55 that night, Marcus texted me to say I needed to remember my place as the family failure. What he did not know was that as his message lit up my phone screen, I was already logging into the encrypted servers of my own multi-million-dollar cybersecurity and data analytics firm, a firm that was currently holding his entire financial future in the palm of my hands. Before I dive into the rest of this story, let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from the toxic people who share your bloodline. Growing up in Atlanta, I was used to Sunday cookouts being the soul of our community. But ever since Marcus married Chloe, the dynamic had shifted from warm family gatherings to pretentious displays of wealth. Marcus was a real estate developer heavily leveraged and obsessed with projecting an image of Black excellence that felt more like a cheap reality television show. Chloe came from a supposedly wealthy background, and she never missed a single opportunity to remind us of her elevated status. The cookout was hosted at their massive rented estate. The moment I arrived with Jamal, Chloe immediately handed me a heavy tray of raw chicken and pointed toward the kitchen like I was the hired help. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple sundress, and gave that tight little smile she always used to mask her insults. She said it was so brave of me to wear last season's discount rack collection to a formal family event. I bit my tongue hard and went straight to the kitchen. My mother Vivian was already in there arranging expensive appetizers on silver platters. Mom always valued status over substance. She fawned over Marcus and Chloe because Marcus was supposedly on the verge of landing a $50 million luxury resort development deal. To my mother, Marcus was the undisputed king of the family, and I was just the struggling single mom working some invisible entry-level computer job. I started prepping the food while keeping a close eye on Jamal through the large bay window. He was a sweet boy, incredibly smart and full of life, but he struggled with dyslexia. We were working on it intensely with tutors, and he was making beautiful progress. But to my image-obsessed family, any learning difference was a mark of shame to be hidden away. Chloe wandered into the kitchen, holding her crystal wine glass. She sighed loudly and asked how Jamal was doing in his special classes. She leaned heavily on the word special, with a thick dose of condescension. She then suggested that maybe if I had chosen a better father for him or secured a higher-paying job, I could afford the kind of elite private tutoring her friends used for their perfect children. My mother chimed in right on cue, agreeing with Chloe completely. Mom told me I needed to face reality and accept that Jamal was just slow. She said I should focus on teaching him a manual trade rather than pushing him academically so he would not embarrass the family name later in life. My hands shook as I washed the vegetables under the cold water, but I kept my mouth shut. Engaging with them only ever led to being gaslit and told I was an angry woman overreacting to their simple, helpful advice. The afternoon dragged on with Marcus holding court by the massive outdoor grill. He was loud and boasting about his upcoming $50 million deal, making sure all the neighbors and extended relatives heard exactly how successful and powerful he was. Jamal had been playing quietly by himself in the yard, avoiding the older cousins who usually teased him. Around 3 o'clock, the food was finally ready, and the kids were allowed to line up first. Jamal waited patiently in line, and when it was his turn, he politely asked his Uncle Marcus for a cheeseburger. I watched from the patio as Marcus looked down at my sweet, innocent boy. Instead of handing him the food, Marcus pulled the plate back sharply. His voice boomed across the yard, catching everyone's immediate attention. He told Jamal that burgers were for the smart kids who brought home straight A report cards. He looked right at me across the lawn and shouted that kids who could not even read at grade level only got the cheap hot dogs or a peanut butter sandwich. He said loudly that we do not reward mediocrity in this family. The entire backyard went completely silent. The upbeat music seemed to fade away into nothing. I expected anyone to step in and say that was a horrible thing to say to an 8-year-old boy. Instead, I heard Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh. I looked at my mother, expecting her maternal instinct to finally kick in and protect her grandson from this abuse. But Vivian just shook her head and took a casual sip of her sweet tea. She actually told the crowd that Marcus was just practicing tough love, and that Jamal needed to learn that the real world does not coddle people who fall behind. My son stood there frozen in front of the grill, his lower lip trembling as the absolute humiliation washed over him. The cousins giggled and whispered, pointing at him. It was a coordinated public execution of an 8-year-old boy's self-esteem, orchestrated by his own uncle and happily endorsed by his grandmother. A cold, heavy wave of clarity crashed over my entire body. I did not yell. I did not throw a drink or cause the kind of dramatic scene they were clearly trying to provoke, so they could label me as unstable. I walked across the manicured grass, my posture completely straight, and my steps measured and calm. I reached my son, took his small, shaking hand in mine, and gently told him we were leaving. Marcus laughed, telling me not to be so sensitive, and that I was ruining a perfectly good boy by coddling him. Chloe shouted from the wooden deck that I was destroying the family vibe by storming off over a harmless joke. I did not even grant them the dignity of a single response. I walked my son to my modest car, buckled him safely into his seat, and drove away from the toxic illusion they called a family. The drive back to our apartment was agonizing. Jamal cried softly in the back seat, asking me why his uncle hated him, and if he was really stupid, because his brain mixed up the letters on the page. Every single tear that fell from his eyes hardened a massive wall of ice around my heart. I pulled the car over, parked on a quiet tree-lined street, and climbed into the back seat to hold him. I held my baby tight and told him he was the smartest, bravest boy I knew in this entire world. I promised him that no one would ever be allowed to make him feel small or unworthy ever again. I told him his mind worked differently because it was designed to do extraordinary things that ordinary, loud people like his uncle could never possibly understand. By the time we got home, he was calm, and I tucked him into bed early, reading his favorite stories until his breathing slowed and he fell asleep. I went to my home office and sat in the dark. For years, I had played the role of the quiet, struggling sister. When I dropped out of my regular corporate tech job to build my own startup, they all assumed I had failed miserably. I let them believe I was just doing basic computer support from home because their constant toxic competition was exhausting. In reality, my real estate data analytics and cybersecurity firm had exploded in value. I secured massive government contracts and major institutional investors. I was personally worth tens of millions of dollars, but I lived quietly, investing everything back into the business and my son's future. At exactly 11:55, my phone lit up on the desk. It was a text message from Marcus. It read that I was just like my son, a fragile failure. He told me to learn my place in this family or stop coming around altogether. I read the message twice. I did not feel the usual sting of rejection or the urge to cry. I felt absolute pure power. I set the phone face down on the desk and opened my laptop. The blue light from the screen illuminated the dark room. I bypassed multiple security firewalls and logged directly into my company's primary investment dashboard. Just hours before the cookout, my chief financial officer had flagged a highly suspicious loan application attempting to leverage a historic family property. It was the deed to Big Mama's land, the exact property our great-grandmother had worked her entire life washing floors to buy. I pulled up the encrypted files and saw Marcus's name plastered all over the fraudulent banking documents. He was secretly drowning in massive debt and desperate for fast cash to secure his fake $50 million deal. He had crossed a legal line that would completely destroy him. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated a total financial audit of his operations. They wanted to talk about who had a future. I was about to make sure Marcus and Chloe had absolutely none. I poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, the steam rising in the quiet stillness of my kitchen. The morning sun was just barely beginning to peek through the blinds, but I had been awake for hours. My laptop sat open on the granite counter surrounded by 3 portable monitors I used for deep data dives. The encrypted dashboard of my firm was flashing a silent, persistent red alert. As the CEO of a cybersecurity company that handles risk assessment for Fortune 500 clients, I built algorithms designed to detect financial anomalies before they turn into full-blown catastrophes. And the anomaly staring back at me right now was screaming fraud. I set my coffee mug down and began tracing the digital breadcrumbs my system had gathered overnight. Marcus was a man completely obsessed with appearances, but his financial reality was a catastrophic disaster. He was drowning in high-interest short-term loans and hiding behind a network of hollow shell companies. The $50 million luxury resort development deal he had been bragging about all afternoon to our relatives was completely stalled. The city zoning board had denied his permits 3 times due to severe environmental and structural concerns. To keep the project alive and prevent his primary investors from pulling their capital, he needed liquid cash immediately. He did not need this money for construction or architecture. He needed it for bribes. He was desperately trying to grease the palms of local politicians to force the permits through the system. But his credit was entirely maxed out, and no legitimate banking institution would touch him. That is when the second alert triggered on my screen and the breath completely left my lungs. He was applying for a massive private equity loan through a shadow lender, and the collateral he listed was Big Mama's land. My great-grandmother had purchased those 60 acres of prime Georgia soil with cash she saved from cleaning houses and taking in laundry for 40 years. It was our family's sacred heritage, the absolute only piece of generational wealth we actually possessed. Big Mama had left the deed in a highly specific trust, requiring the legal notarized signature of both my mother and myself to ever sell, leverage, or alter the property in any way. I stared at the scanned loan application pulled directly from the lender's unsecured server. There, at the bottom of the 3rd page, was my signature perfectly forged. Marcus had not just insulted my son. He had committed felony identity theft to steal the very land my great-grandmother bled for, just to fund his ego-driven illegal real estate scam. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs, but my mind remained ice-cold and hyper-focused. I ran a cross-check on the notary public who stamped the fraudulent document. It was a man named Kevin who worked directly in Marcus's development firm as an administrative assistant. They had orchestrated this entire criminal scheme right under my nose, assuming I was too uneducated and too disconnected from the business world to ever find out. But what disturbed me the most was the other signature on the document. My mother's signature was sitting right next to my forged one, and unlike mine, it did not look fake at all. It looked entirely genuine. I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went before I burned his fragile empire to the absolute ground. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding intensely annoyed and breathless, as if I had interrupted something incredibly important. She did not ask how Jamal was doing after the horrific scene at the cookout. She did not ask if we made it home safely. She just demanded to know what I wanted so early on a Sunday morning. I kept my voice perfectly level, masking the absolute rage boiling inside my chest. I told her I was organizing some old financial files and noticed the property tax bill for Big Mama's land had been redirected to Marcus's downtown business address. I casually asked if everything was all right with the family property. There was a heavy pause on the line. The silence stretched out thick, with sudden undeniable tension. Then her voice dropped into that familiar, condescending tone she always used when she was about to put me in my place. She told me to stop snooping around in grown-up business and focus on my own messy life. I pressed harder, keeping my tone deceptively innocent. I told her that I was just worried because I saw a strange alert on my credit report regarding a commercial mortgage inquiry connected directly to the land. I asked her point blank if Marcus was trying to borrow money against our heritage without telling me. My mother snapped. She did not deny the accusation. Instead, she fiercely defended him just like she always did. She yelled through the phone that Marcus was doing exactly what had to be done to secure our family's future and elevate our status. She said his resort deal was going to make us millions of dollars and that the private lender just needed a little temporary security to push the loan through the final approval stages. I asked her how he managed to get my signature on the collateral documents without my permission or presence. She scoffed loudly and completely dismissed my concern as if I were complaining about a stolen pen rather than a federal crime. She told me it was just paperwork and that Marcus handled the technicalities to save me the headache since I would not understand the complex financial terms anyway. She actually praised him for taking the initiative to move the family forward while I was supposedly dragging us down. I asked her if she realized he was committing a severe felony and risking the only true asset our family owned. My mother actually laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the phone speaker and made my blood run freezing cold. She said Marcus was building a massive empire and bringing true glory to the family name. She told me I should be on my knees, feeling grateful he was willing to carry the heavy weight of our legacy. She explicitly stated that a single mother working a mediocre computer job could never achieve anything remotely important in this world. Her final words before she hung up on me were a strict, vicious warning. She told me not to dare stand in his way or try to ruin his multi-million-dollar deal out of pure selfish jealousy. She said if I opened my mouth or tried to block the loan, I would be entirely dead to her and the rest of the family. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to the granite counter. The betrayal was absolute and complete. My own mother had happily sold out my great-grandmother's legacy and enthusiastically endorsed the theft of my identity, all to feed the delusion of her golden child. They had humiliated my innocent son to elevate themselves in front of a crowd. Now they were attempting to steal my heritage and risk my legal standing to save themselves from bankruptcy. They truly believed I was a powerless, helpless bystander in my own life. They thought I was a poor, struggling woman who would just bow her head and take the abuse because I had no resources to fight back. I turned back to my multi-monitor setup, my fingers resting lightly on the mechanical keyboard. It was time to show them exactly what a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity CEO could do to a house built entirely on arrogance and fraud. The morning light crept through the blinds of my home office, but I had not moved from my chair. My eyes were locked on the glowing screens mapping out the digital blueprint of my brother's financial ruin. The most obvious reaction to discovering a felony forgery would be to pick up the phone and call the police. I could have sent a squad car to Marcus's ridiculous rented mansion right then and there. He would be arrested in his driveway wearing his expensive silk pajamas. It would have been a quick, explosive victory. But a criminal charge was too simple. It was too blunt. If I called the authorities, my mother would immediately play the victim. She would drain her own retirement accounts to post his bail. She would hire the best defense attorneys in the city and spin a massive narrative to the entire extended family about how I was a vindictive, jealous sister trying to destroy a successful black man over a simple paperwork misunderstanding. I did not want a messy public trial. I did not want my mother finding a way to excuse his behavior. I wanted absolute total control. I wanted to hold the strings to his entire life in my hands before he even realized he was a puppet. I needed a surgical strike, and I had the exact financial machinery to execute it. 3 days later, I sat in the heavily soundproofed downtown office of my private corporate attorney, Robert Sterling. The room smelled of expensive leather and old paper. From an over-the-shoulder view, anyone watching would see a quiet, unassuming woman in a simple beige trench coat sitting across from one of the most ruthless legal minds on the East Coast. Robert was one of the very few people who knew the true scale of my wealth. He managed the legal architecture of my cybersecurity firm and handled my anonymous investments. Robert spread the printed copies of Marcus's loan application across the polished mahogany table. He traced a finger over the crude forgery of my signature and shook his head in absolute disbelief. He told me it was the most arrogant, sloppy attempt at fraud he had seen in his 30-year career. He confirmed that Marcus was borrowing exactly $4.2 million from a predatory private lending group called Ironclad Finance. Ironclad was notorious for funding high-risk commercial developments at astronomical interest rates. They did not care about Marcus's business acumen. They only cared that he had listed a pristine, debt-free 60-acre property as collateral. Robert looked at me over his glasses and asked if I wanted him to draft a cease and desist order or go straight to the district attorney. I took a slow sip of the black coffee his assistant had brought in. I told Robert we were not going to stop the loan. We were going to buy it. I owned a private venture capital branch called Apex Vanguard. It was a completely insulated holding company I used for aggressive corporate acquisitions and discrete investments. There was absolutely no public link between Apex Vanguard and my name or my primary cybersecurity firm. To the outside world, it was just another faceless corporate entity sitting on a massive pile of liquid cash. I explained my strategy to Robert. Ironclad Finance was currently holding Marcus's loan application, but they were getting nervous. My analytics software showed that Marcus's zoning permits for the luxury resort had been flagged again by the city's Environmental Protection Board. Ironclad was holding a high-risk asset, and they knew Marcus was bleeding cash. I instructed Robert to have Apex Vanguard approach Ironclad immediately. We would offer to buy Marcus's debt portfolio in its entirety. We would pay them a premium in pure cash to take the risk off their hands. Ironclad would be thrilled to exit a stalling development deal with a guaranteed profit. They would happily sign over the paper. Robert leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face as he realized exactly what I was doing. By purchasing the debt through my holding company, I was effectively becoming my brother's sole creditor. Marcus would receive his $4.2 million. He would think he had won. He would think he successfully forged my name, bypassed my authority, and secured the funds to bribe his way through the city zoning board. But legally, Apex Vanguard would own the mortgage. Apex Vanguard would hold the lien on Big Mama's land. And I was Apex Vanguard. The legal machinery moved with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, Robert had executed the buyout. Ironclad Finance transferred the entire debt portfolio to my holding company. I sat in Robert's office and signed the final acquisition papers. As I pressed my pen to the heavy parchment, I looked down at my real signature. It was sharp, precise, and authentic. It stood in stark contrast to the shaky, desperate forgery my brother had submitted just days prior. With that single stroke of a pen, Marcus officially became my property. Every dollar he spent, every brick he laid for his imaginary luxury resort was now legally tied to a company I controlled with absolute authority. I had effectively pulled the ground out from under him while making him feel like he was standing on top of the world. He was a man walking on a tightrope, and I was the one holding the safety net, deciding exactly when to pull it away. That Friday evening, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while I was helping Jamal with his reading homework. It was a notification from the family group chat. Marcus had sent a massive block of text accompanied by a photo of himself and Chloe clinking crystal champagne flutes at a high-end steakhouse. The message read in all capital letters that he had just secured the final round of funding for the resort. He bragged that the money was officially in his accounts and construction would begin by the end of the month. He called himself a visionary. He thanked our mother for always believing in him and told the rest of the family to get ready because he was about to elevate the family name to a level none of us could comprehend. My mother immediately replied with a string of heart emojis calling him her brilliant king. My sister-in-law Chloe added a comment saying that true success requires bold moves that small-minded people could never understand. It was a thinly veiled shot at me continuing the narrative they had established at the cookout. I sat at my kitchen island watching the celebratory messages roll in one after another. They were cheering for a victory funded by a felony. They were toasting to a $4 million rope that was currently wrapped tightly around Marcus's neck. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had bypassed the quiet sister he despised so much. He had no clue that the faceless corporate giant now holding the deed to our family's heritage and the rights to his entire financial future was sitting in a modest apartment helping an 8-year-old boy sound out vocabulary words. I did not reply to the group chat. I did not send a passive-aggressive comment or try to diminish his celebration. I simply locked my phone screen and turned my full attention back to my son. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Marcus had all the money he needed to dig his hole even deeper. All I had to do now was wait in the absolute silence for the perfect moment to call in his debt. 2 weeks had passed since I quietly purchased my brother's fraudulent debt and effectively became the sole owner of his financial future. The illusion of his massive success was currently on full public display at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary dinner. We were seated in the heavily decorated private dining room of an incredibly exclusive French restaurant downtown. It was a place Marcus had specifically insisted on booking to flaunt his newly acquired capital to the rest of the extended family. The crystal chandeliers hanging above us cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table, illuminating the fine china and polished silver. I watched the entire scene unfold with absolute emotional detachment. My mother was holding court at the head of the table, wearing a blindingly expensive new diamond necklace Marcus and Chloe had just presented to her before the appetizers arrived. She was practically glowing with immense pride, hanging on to every single word my brother said, and repeatedly telling the other relatives how incredibly blessed she was to have such a visionary son. Marcus sat directly next to her, swirling a glass of vintage wine and loudly detailing his supposed construction timelines for the luxury resort. He was playing the role of the self-made billionaire perfectly. He was completely unaware that the actual corporate giant holding his financial execution orders was sitting quietly at the opposite end of the table, cutting up a piece of roasted chicken for her 8-year-old son. Marcus barked orders at the waitstaff, snapped his fingers when his water glass was low, and behaved with the aggressive arrogance of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. Chloe was seated next to him, projecting the flawless image of a wealthy and highly supportive wife. She wore a dress that screamed expensive couture and a smile that radiated pure, unadulterated condescension. Throughout the first 3 courses, she made sure to direct subtle, pointed remarks my way. She loudly asked if my little computer job was paying me enough to keep the lights on in my apartment. She offered to send me some of her old designer clothes to wear to the office so I could look a bit more presentable. I smiled politely and gave quiet, non-committal answers, completely refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was desperately fishing for. My absolute silence and refusal to act humiliated only seemed to agitate her further. She wanted me to feel small, but I was sitting on a mountain of power she could not even begin to comprehend. As the waiters cleared our main courses and poured coffee for the table, Chloe decided it was time to shift the spotlight back to her own supposed generosity. She stood up and announced to the entire room that she had brought special celebration gifts for all the grandchildren to mark the family milestone. She signaled a waiter who brought over several beautifully wrapped heavy boxes from the coat check room. The other children at the table, my cousin's kids, eagerly tore into their expensive gifts. Chloe had purchased them the latest premium tablets, high-end wireless headphones, and limited edition designer sneakers. The parents gushed with overwhelming gratitude, praising Marcus and Chloe for spoiling the children and being such incredible role models. Then Chloe turned her malicious attention to my son Jamal. She slid a very thin, hastily wrapped package across the pristine white tablecloth. It severely lacked the heavy, expensive feel of the other gifts. Jamal looked up at me for permission, and I gave him a small, encouraging nod. He carefully peeled back the cheap paper. Inside was a flimsy dollar store coloring book meant for toddlers, complete with a small cardboard box of oversized, chunky crayons. Jamal stared at the items in quiet confusion. He was an incredibly brilliant 8-year-old who was currently reading 3 grade levels ahead of his peers and obsessed with building complex, functional robotic models. He knew exactly what this was, and he knew it was an insult. Chloe did not wait for his reaction. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her perfectly manicured hands, and projected her voice so every single person at the long table could hear her clearly. She smiled that sickeningly sweet fake smile and said she heard he was a bit slow in his development, so she figured a preschool coloring book would be exactly his speed. The entire private dining room went dead silent. The clinking of expensive silverware stopped completely. The quiet, pleasant hum of family conversation vanished in an instant. I looked directly at my mother, expecting her to intervene and immediately reprimand Chloe for publicly insulting her own grandson. Instead, my mother simply took a slow sip of her wine and looked out the window, completely validating the horrific insult through her deliberate silence. Marcus let out a short, amused chuckle, shaking his head side to side, as if Chloe had just delivered a brilliant comedic punchline. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink across the table. I did not exhibit the loud, angry stereotype they were all eagerly waiting for. I calmly placed my white linen napkin on the table and stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the desperately quiet room. I reached across the table and picked up the insulting coloring book. I walked slowly, deliberately around the edge of the large table until I was standing directly behind Chloe. The smug, arrogant smile on her face began to falter slightly as I dropped the cheap book directly onto her expensive chocolate dessert plate, splashing dark raspberry sauce onto the sleeve of her dress. I kept my voice incredibly low, icy, and completely steady, ensuring the entire table had to hold their collective breath to hear every single word I said. I told her that my son was currently testing in the 99th percentile for mathematics and reading comprehension nationwide. I told her he built functional circuit boards for fun on the weekends, while she spent her entire life staging fake luxury photos for an audience of strangers who did not actually care if she lived or died. I told her that attacking a brilliant, innocent 8-year-old child to compensate for her own crushing intellectual and moral inadequacies was the most pathetic display of deep-rooted insecurity I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Chloe gasped loudly, her face turning a deep, mottled red. She tried to stand up, but I stepped closer, forcing her to remain seated in her chair. I was nowhere near finished. I decided to pull back the curtain on the fake reality she was so desperately trying to sell to my family. I asked her loudly why she was buying expensive premium tablets for the other children when her own personal credit score was currently sitting in the low 500s. I asked her how she planned to pay off the massive limit on her 3 secondary credit cards, which she had maxed out completely just to maintain the fragile illusion of wealth. I pointed out that the designer dress she was currently wearing was a cheap counterfeit knockoff imported from an overseas replica site because they could not actually afford the genuine article. The table gasped in unison. My mother dropped her wine glass, the dark red liquid spilling aggressively onto the white tablecloth. Marcus stood up violently, his chair crashing backward to the floor. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly in my face and demanded to know how I dared to speak to his wife that way in front of the family. He yelled that I was a bitter, jealous failure trying to ruin their beautiful evening because I was miserable in my own pathetic life. He ordered me to apologize to Chloe immediately and beg our mother for forgiveness for ruining the anniversary dinner. I turned my attention slowly from the trembling wife to my brother. I looked him directly in the eyes. I saw the desperate manic energy hiding just behind his aggressive physical posture. I stepped away from Chloe and walked right up to him, closing the distance between us. I lowered my voice even further, stepping directly into his personal space. I told him he had absolutely no right to demand respect from anyone in this room. I told him I knew exactly how he funded the expensive dinner we were currently eating. I told him I knew his highly publicized resort development deal was a failing sinking ship and that he was desperately borrowing money from predatory lenders just to keep the lights on in his rented mansion. I told him that buying expensive jewelry for our mother did not make him a successful businessman. It just made him a highly skilled fraud who was drowning in debt he could never possibly repay. Marcus froze completely. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and utterly terrified. The aggressive, protective bravado vanished in a single instant. He realized in that specific moment that I knew far more about his financial reality than I should ever possibly know. He still had absolutely no idea that I owned his massive debt, but he suddenly realized his darkest, most guarded secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I turned back to Jamal, who was watching me with wide, highly observant eyes. I smiled warmly at my beautiful son, told him to gather his coat, and promised him we were leaving this place to get gourmet ice cream instead of sitting in a room full of toxic, fraudulent people. I did not look back at my mother. I did not say a single word of goodbye to the extended family. I held my son's hand securely and walked out of the private dining room with my head held high and my posture perfect. Behind me, the silence was absolute and crushing. The grand illusion Marcus and Chloe had spent weeks meticulously building was fractured beyond repair. They were left sitting in a puddle of spilled wine and massive public humiliation, holding a cheap dollar store coloring book. The quiet counterattack had officially been launched, and they had absolutely no idea that the real permanent destruction was still coming for them. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room had barely swung shut behind me when the sharp, frantic clicking of heels echoed against the polished marble floor. My mother was practically sprinting to catch up with us. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, the perspective would be a shaky handheld shot tracking rapidly behind me before whipping around to catch the sudden explosion of violence. The previously serene and sophisticated atmosphere of the main restaurant shattered instantly as she closed the distance. She grabbed my left shoulder with a grip so vicious her manicured nails dug painfully through the fabric of my coat. I turned around instinctively, using my momentum to sweep Jamal behind my legs, shielding him from whatever erratic behavior she was about to unleash. I did not even have a fraction of a second to brace myself. My mother swung her right arm with blinding speed. The open palm slap echoed like a gunshot across the quiet, elegant dining room. The sheer physical force of the blow snapped my head violently to the side. A sharp, piercing ring filled my left ear, and the hot, metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth. My teeth had sliced deep into my lower lip from the brutal impact. Gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. Diners froze instantly with their expensive wine glasses hovering halfway to their mouths. Waiters stopped dead in their tracks, their silver trays paralyzed in midair. The entire restaurant descended into a shocked, suffocating silence. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not raise my hand to cradle my cheek. I did not flinch or retreat. I kept my posture completely rigid and heavily anchored, ensuring my son remained safely tucked behind me, completely insulated from her physical rage. My mother stood there, trembling with absolute unhinged fury, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking diamond-ringed finger directly at my face. She completely ignored the dozens of affluent strangers watching her public meltdown. Instead, she unleashed a vitriolic tirade that had clearly been brewing inside her for decades. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous disappointment who simply could not stand to see anyone else succeed. She demanded to know how I dared to disrespect Marcus and his wife in front of our entire family. She yelled that Chloe was a woman of true high-class breeding, her precious, sophisticated white daughter-in-law, who deserved absolute unyielding respect. According to my mother, I was nothing but a miserable, worthless failure trying to drag my incredibly successful brother down to my own pathetic level. She hurled the words at me with genuine, unfiltered hatred. She said I was a walking embarrassment to the family name. She screamed that my jealousy over Marcus's multi-million-dollar empire was eating me alive, making me act like a wild, uncultured animal who did not know how to behave in polite society. She told me I had intentionally ruined their beautiful anniversary celebration because I was fundamentally incapable of experiencing joy for anyone but myself. Every single word she weaponized was a deliberate, calculated attempt to shatter my self-esteem and force me back into the tiny, insignificant box she had built for me since childhood. She wanted to break me right there in the middle of the crowded restaurant to prove her ultimate dominance and violently protect her golden child. I stood absolutely still, letting her completely exhaust her frantic, manic energy. The physical sting radiating across my cheek was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing clarity that was rapidly taking over my mind. For 35 years, I had desperately sought this woman's approval. I had endured her snide remarks, her blatant favoritism, her constant financial demands, and her endless belittling, all because I blindly believed that deep down, she possessed some shred of unconditional maternal love for me. That pathetic delusion evaporated permanently in the span of a single heartbeat. The mother standing in front of me was a complete stranger, violently defending a fraudulent illusion while physically attacking her own flesh and blood. She had made her choice permanently and irreversibly. I raised my hand slowly and deliberately. I used the back of my thumb to wipe the smear of warm blood running from my split lip. I looked at the bright red stain on my skin for a brief second before locking my eyes directly onto hers. I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were entirely dry, devoid of any sorrow, grief, or submission. The only thing radiating from my posture was cold, calculating, absolute power. My mother's furious, aggressive expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She had fully expected me to cry, to crumble, to run away in absolute shame, just like I always did when I was younger. My total lack of an emotional breakdown severely unnerved her. Marcus had followed her out into the main dining area and was now standing a few paces behind her. He was breathing heavily, his expensive custom suit jacket slightly wrinkled, looking exactly like a man desperately trying to maintain a rapidly crumbling facade. He clearly thought his mother's physical assault had put me back in my place. He thought the public humiliation would silence me forever and force me into submission. I stepped forward, closing the physical gap between my mother and myself. She instinctively took a half step backward, suddenly intimidated by the sheer lack of fear in my eyes. I looked right past her, focusing my complete undivided attention on Marcus. A slow, freezing smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy or conciliation. It was the smile of a predator looking directly at trapped prey. I kept my voice incredibly calm, projecting my words so they carried perfectly across the dead silent restaurant, cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical blade. I told Marcus that I genuinely wanted to congratulate him. I said I wanted to officially recognize his brilliant $50 million luxury resort project and the incredible staggering lengths he was willing to go to secure his funding. I praised his highly aggressive business tactics and told him that his desperate late-night financial maneuvers were truly something to behold. I congratulated him specifically on the massive private equity loan he was so proudly celebrating tonight. Marcus's eyes widened in sheer absolute panic. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost standing beneath the glowing crystal chandeliers. He realized in that exact microsecond that my knowledge of his affairs was not just a passing jealous suspicion. I possessed intimate, specific, highly guarded details of his confidential financial lifelines. The confident, arrogant billionaire persona he had been broadcasting all night vanished instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, exposed fraud. I continued speaking, my tone dripping with lethal precision. I told him to enjoy every single second of this beautiful, expensive anniversary dinner because running a multi-million-dollar empire built entirely on high-interest shadow debt and forged legal documents was an incredibly stressful endeavor. I wished him the absolute best of luck with his impending construction deadlines, his angry primary investors, and his endless battles with the city zoning board. I told him he was going to need every single ounce of that luck in the very near future when his creditors finally came to collect their absolute due. I did not explicitly mention the holding company. I did not tell him that I was the phantom corporate entity currently holding the deed to his financial execution. I wanted him to sweat in pure ignorance. I wanted him to lay awake in his rented mansion, terrified of the invisible walls rapidly closing in around his fragile empire. My congratulatory words were a perfectly wrapped death sentence delivered with a blood-stained smile. My mother tried to speak, attempting to launch another furious verbal assault to defend him, but her voice completely failed her. The sheer dominant confidence in my posture and the terrifying implication of my words to Marcus had completely neutralized her rage. She looked frantically back at her golden boy, expecting him to retaliate, to put me in my place with his usual loud, arrogant bravado. But Marcus was entirely paralyzed. He stood frozen in the center of the upscale restaurant, staring at me with absolute, unadulterated fear. I turned my back on them both. I adjusted my coat, gripped Jamal's small hand securely in mine, and walked straight out the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant. The cool, crisp night air hit my face instantly, clearing away the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of that dining room. I did not look back. I did not need to. The battle of petty words and physical intimidation was entirely over. The real war, the quiet, ruthless financial decimation of Marcus's life was already in motion. They had chosen their path, and I had chosen mine. The next time we spoke, it would not be as family members screaming at a dinner table. It would be as a silent corporate creditor dismantling a desperate debtor brick by fraudulent brick. The grand ballroom of the sprawling downtown country club was suffocatingly opulent. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a blinding light over ice sculptures, imported orchids, and hundreds of wealthy local investors dressed in custom tuxedos and designer gowns. This was Marcus's ultimate fundraising gala, the grand public unveiling of his imaginary luxury resort project. He had rented the most expensive venue in the city using the very funds he had secured through his fraudulent private equity loan. The entire evening was a desperate, highly calculated theatrical performance designed to convince the local politicians and zoning board members that he was a legitimate heavy-hitting real estate mogul. I stood completely still in the shadowed alcove near the massive arched doors, a glass of sparkling mineral water resting lightly in my right hand. I was not formally invited to this event. I simply walked past the security detail at the front entrance because the event was technically being paid for by capital that belonged entirely to my holding company. I owned the ground Marcus was currently standing on. The live jazz band abruptly stopped playing as the heavy velvet curtains at the front of the room were pulled back. The crowd applauded as Marcus confidently stepped onto the raised podium. He wore a pristine midnight blue tuxedo that was tailored to absolute perfection. His smile was blindingly bright, radiating the aggressive, magnetic charisma that had fooled our mother and the rest of the family for decades. From a slow, continuous tracking perspective, the visual focus pushed steadily inward, closing the distance until the frame rested entirely on Marcus's arrogantly triumphant face. He gripped the microphone with both hands, soaking in the applause of the city's elite. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had conquered the entire world. The perspective then smoothly shifted, panning across the crowded room to rest entirely on my face. I stood in the dim light, completely motionless. My expression was perfectly blank, displaying the cold, detached observation of a scientist watching a laboratory rat eagerly approach a loaded spring trap. Marcus raised his hand to quiet the cheering crowd. He began a long, practiced monologue about vision, perseverance, and the heavy burden of generational greatness. He spoke passionately about overcoming small-minded obstacles and pushing past the jealous doubters who lacked the mental capacity to understand true wealth. Every single word was a deliberate, thinly veiled insult directed entirely at me. My mother Vivian was standing in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. She was wearing another new expensive gown, wiping away dramatic tears of joy as she watched her golden child command the room. Chloe stood right beside her, dripping in heavy diamond jewelry that I knew for a fact was purchased on a dangerously high-interest credit line. They were feeding off his delusional energy, completely intoxicated by the fake reality he had constructed. Then Marcus delivered the exact words I had come to hear. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at the city zoning commissioners seated at the VIP tables. He proudly announced that after months of intense negotiation, he had officially secured the ultimate financial backing to bring his $50 million resort to life. He bragged that the legendary private equity firm Apex Vanguard had recognized his sheer brilliance and chosen to fully fund his entire development project. He spoke the name of my holding company with absolute reverence. He told the captivated audience that Apex Vanguard was a ruthless, untouchable giant in the financial sector, and that their decision to back his project was the ultimate validation of his genius. He proudly declared that the final $50 million disbursement contract would be signed, sealed, and delivered by the absolute end of the month. Listening to my brother publicly worship my shadow company was the most profoundly satisfying experience of my entire life. He was standing on a brightly lit stage, eagerly bragging to hundreds of people about handing his throat directly to the executioner. He actually believed he had outsmarted the system. He believed he had successfully bypassed his mediocre sister, forged her signature, and tricked a massive Wall Street entity into funding his illegal bribes and architectural fantasies. He had absolutely no idea that the ruthless, untouchable financial giant he was currently praising was the exact same woman he had been tormenting, humiliating, and stealing from since childhood. The trap had not just snapped shut. He had willingly locked himself inside and handed me the only key. As the crowd erupted into a massive standing ovation, Marcus handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and stepped down from the podium. He immediately began working the room, shaking hands and posing for photographs with local politicians. It did not take him long to spot me standing quietly in the shadows near the exit. The moment he saw me, his triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it quickly morphed into a sneer of pure, malicious arrogance. He whispered something to Chloe and my mother. The three of them immediately broke away from their circle of admirers and marched directly toward my corner of the ballroom. They moved like a pack of predators eager to finish off a wounded animal. Marcus stopped 2 feet in front of me, casually swirling the champagne in his crystal flute. He looked me up and down with exaggerated pity. He asked me what I was doing crashing an exclusive event that was clearly miles above my tax bracket. He chuckled deeply and asked if I had finally come to my senses and decided to beg him for a low-level administrative job at his new resort. Chloe chimed in immediately, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She told me I should be incredibly grateful that Marcus was willing to overlook my horrific behavior at the anniversary dinner and still allow me to stand in the same room as his wealthy investors. My mother simply glared at me, her eyes narrowed with sharp resentment, warning me silently not to cause another scene and embarrass her golden boy in front of the city elite. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear me over the ambient noise of the crowded ballroom. I told him I was simply dropping by to congratulate him on securing such a massive legendary backer for his project. I asked him with deceptive innocence how he managed to land a deal with a firm as notoriously strict and aggressive as Apex Vanguard. Marcus took the bait without a single second of hesitation. His ego completely overrode any basic sense of caution. He puffed out his chest again, eager to assert his absolute dominance over me. He began lying through his teeth with terrifying ease. He claimed that the acquisition process was incredibly complex and required a level of financial literacy I could never possibly comprehend. He boasted that he had personally flown to New York to have private closed-door dinners with the board of directors. He actually looked me dead in the eye and claimed that the anonymous CEO of Apex Vanguard was a close personal friend of his now. He said they had shared expensive scotch and laughed together about how easily Marcus was going to dominate the local real estate market. I listened to his elaborate, ridiculous fiction without blinking. My brother was standing in front of me, vividly describing a fake dinner with a fake friend, completely oblivious to the fact that the CEO of Apex Vanguard was currently staring right back at him, memorizing every single lie that fell from his mouth. I asked him if he had read the fine print of the disbursement contract carefully. I mentioned casually that firms like Apex Vanguard were famous for embedding brutal acceleration clauses into their mezzanine debt structures, allowing them to seize all collateral immediately upon any breach of contract. Marcus scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in my face. He told me to stop pretending I knew anything about high-level corporate finance. He said his lawyers had reviewed every single page of the agreement, and the terms were absolutely perfect. He proudly reiterated that the $50 million transfer was guaranteed to hit his accounts by the end of the month, securing his empire permanently. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of alcohol and expensive cologne. He whispered that I had lost the war. He told me that Big Mama's land was going to be the foundation of a modern empire, and there was absolutely nothing my bitter, jealous mind could do to stop it. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I had shown him in years. The quiet, chilling confidence in my expression caused his arrogant smirk to waver slightly. He searched my eyes, looking for the familiar pain or submission he was so used to extracting from me, but he found absolutely nothing but empty, bottomless void. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, preparing to leave the stifling ballroom. I looked at my mother, who was still glaring at me with unjustified hatred. I looked at Chloe, who was adjusting her fake diamonds. Finally, I looked back at the man who had stolen my identity and mortgaged our family heritage. I told Marcus that his speech was truly magnificent. I told him that I was incredibly impressed by his relationship with the CEO of Apex Vanguard. I promised him that I would not dream of standing in his way anymore. As I turned to walk out the heavy arched doors, I glanced back over my shoulder one final time. I told him I was very much looking forward to the end of the month. I assured him with absolute terrifying sincerity that the final contract signing was going to be an event he would remember for the rest of his natural life. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving my brother standing in his expensive tuxedo, completely unaware that the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. The visual perspective shifts smoothly as a Steadicam glides through the quiet expanse of my penthouse living room, capturing the golden city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows. I am seated in a deep leather armchair, a single crystal glass of sparkling water resting on the side table beside me. The ambient lighting is low and sophisticated, casting long shadows across the thick dossiers spread open on my lap. Marcus was already walking blindly into the financial slaughterhouse I had constructed for him, but my brother was only half of the equation. Chloe was the other half, and she required a completely different kind of dismantling. While Marcus was a loud, arrogant fool driven by blind ego, Chloe was a calculated parasite. She had spent years actively tormenting me, looking down her perfectly contoured nose at my son and projecting the image of a wealthy, highly educated aristocrat. I wanted to know exactly where her supposed generational wealth came from. The scene cuts sharply to the harsh fluorescent lights of a secure conference room inside the Apex Vanguard corporate headquarters. I am standing at the head of a massive glass table, surrounded by my top-tier financial investigators and forensic accountants. The energy in the room is electric and intensely focused. My lead investigator, David, slides a thick, meticulously tabbed binder directly into my hands. I open the file, and the meticulously crafted illusion of Chloe's entire life immediately shatters into a million pathetic pieces. The Steadicam returns to me in my quiet living room, where I slowly turn the pages of the dossier, a cold, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. Chloe had sold my mother and the entire extended family a brilliant fairy tale. She claimed to be the heiress of a prominent New England shipping family, educated at exclusive Swiss boarding schools, and accustomed to a life of high society privilege. The actual truth, printed clearly on the certified background checks in my hands, was profoundly different. Her real name was Chloe Miller. She was born in a dilapidated trailer park in rural Ohio to parents who had filed for bankruptcy 3 separate times before she turned 18. Poverty is not a crime, and I would never judge a person for their humble beginnings. But Chloe had not just escaped her past. She had aggressively buried it beneath a mountain of lies and then weaponized her fake aristocratic pedigree to degrade and humiliate people like me and Jamal. The camera perspective shifts back to the glass-walled war room. David points to a series of highlighted bank transfers projected onto the large digital screen on the wall. He explains exactly how Chloe managed to fund her expensive designer wardrobe and lease the luxury vehicles she and Marcus flaunted so proudly. She had never been an independent wealth consultant, as she claimed. For the past 4 years, Chloe had been working as a mid-level administrative assistant at a boutique retirement management firm that catered exclusively to elderly high-net-worth individuals. Her job gave her direct, unrestricted access to the sensitive financial data of senior citizens who had declining cognitive abilities and no immediate family members to oversee their accounts. I stare at the projected screen in the war room, feeling a sharp spike of absolute disgust replacing my previous amusement. Chloe was not just a liar, she was an active, vicious predator. David brings up the specific details of her embezzlement scheme. She had been quietly identifying clients suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Once she isolated a vulnerable target, she systematically opened secondary shadow credit lines in their names. She forged their signatures, manipulated their monthly statements, and rerouted the funds through a complex web of offshore shell accounts before depositing the stolen money directly into her own personal checking accounts. The scene transitions back to my dimly lit living room where I take a slow sip of water, letting the sheer magnitude of her crimes settle in my mind. She was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from helpless elderly people. This was the brilliant, sophisticated woman my mother worshipped. This was the flawless white aristocrat who had dared to slide a cheap dollar store coloring book across a pristine restaurant table and insult my brilliant 8-year-old son. She had called Jamal slow while she was actively funding her counterfeit designer dresses and Marcus's fake billionaire lifestyle with money stolen from dying octogenarians. The staggering hypocrisy was so profound it bordered on pure psychotic delusion. In the corporate war room, I lean over the glass table, placing both hands flat against the cool surface. I ask David exactly how much she has stolen to date. He taps his tablet and a final number flashes on the screen. Over $800,000. She had completely drained the life savings of a widow named Eleanor and maxed out fraudulent credit cards under the name of a retired veteran named Arthur. She used Arthur's stolen pension to pay for the massive deposit on the luxury venue where Marcus had hosted his absurd $50 million fundraising gala. My brother's entire public triumph was literally financed by the systematic abuse of helpless senior citizens. I look at David and instruct him to compile every single piece of forensic evidence, every forged signature, every IP address log, and every illegal bank transfer into a master encrypted file. I tell him to prepare the documents for immediate handoff to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. David nods but asks if we should alert the authorities immediately. I shake my head no. Timing in warfare is absolutely everything. If I turned her in today, the police would arrest her quietly at her desk, and Marcus would undoubtedly try to spin the situation claiming he was an innocent victim of a deceptive wife. He would play the martyr, and my mother would eagerly support his tragic narrative. I could not allow that to happen. Their absolute destruction needed to be simultaneous, public, and entirely inescapable. The Steadicam circles me slowly in the living room, capturing the cold, calculated resolve settling permanently over my features. I close the thick dossier and rest my hands gently on top of the leather cover. Marcus and Chloe were a match made in absolute fraudulent heaven. Two parasitic grifters who had somehow convinced themselves that they were superior to everyone else around them. They thought they had outsmarted the banks, outsmarted the law, and outsmarted me. They were currently sleeping soundly in their rented mansion, completely unaware that I now possessed the exact coordinates of their impending ruin. Chloe wanted to be treated like an aristocrat. She wanted the world to bow down to her perceived superiority and admire her stolen wealth. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted: I was going to ensure that her name was permanently etched into the public record, but it would not be in the society pages or the luxury lifestyle magazines. It would be printed in bold black ink on a federal indictment. I would let them enjoy their final few weeks of delusional grandeur. I would let Marcus plan his massive contract signing party and invite every single wealthy investor and politician he wanted to impress. I would let Chloe buy one more counterfeit designer gown with stolen money to wear to her husband's ultimate triumph. I leaned back in the leather chair, the city lights reflecting brightly in my eyes. The trap was no longer just a financial snare designed to bankrupt my brother. It had evolved into a perfectly orchestrated federal sting operation. When the end of the month finally arrived and Marcus confidently raised his gold-plated pen to sign the $50 million Apex Vanguard disbursement contract, the doors to the venue were not going to open for the press or the catering staff. They were going to open for a highly coordinated team of federal agents armed with arrest warrants for massive wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. I would be standing right there in the front row, watching the fake aristocrat and the fake billionaire finally reap the absolute devastation they had so gleefully sown. The final 48 hours before the scheduled contract signing played out exactly like a psychological thriller. If a camera were actively documenting Marcus during those 2 days, the lens would be entirely restricted to tight, claustrophobic angles. The lighting would be dark, harsh, and unforgiving. The framing would track his movements with a jerky, erratic instability, perfectly mirroring his rapidly deteriorating mental state. He was a man completely cornered by his own towering hubris, pacing the hardwood floors of his rented mansion like a caged animal. I did not need to be in the room to see it. The comprehensive daily surveillance briefings provided by my lead investigator, David, painted the cinematic picture with absolute terrifying clarity. Marcus had completely exhausted his financial runway. The initial private equity loan I had secretly purchased was entirely gone, drained by his desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of active construction, and heavily depleted by Chloe's relentless parasitic spending. He was completely out of legitimate capital, and the massive $50 million disbursement from Apex Vanguard was the only thing keeping his artificial empire from collapsing into dust. But Marcus had a severe immediate problem. He needed to host the final signing gala to maintain his wealthy facade in front of the city's zoning commissioners and elite investors. He needed the grand ballroom, the imported caviar, the premium champagne, and the media presence to solidify his fake reality. And he had absolutely zero cash left to pay for any of it. David's wiretaps intercepted the frantic, terrifying phone calls Marcus made in the dead of night. He had exhausted every single traditional lending avenue. The banks had slammed their doors in his face months ago. His wealthy friends had quietly stopped returning his calls after sensing the desperation radiating from him. With his back pressed firmly against a concrete wall, Marcus did the absolute worst thing a desperate man could possibly do. He reached out to a notorious syndicate of shadow lenders operating strictly in the black market. These were not corporate bankers who used sharply dressed lawyers and court orders to collect their delinquent debts. These were violent, predatory loan sharks who used physical intimidation and brutal leverage to guarantee their returns. I listened to the audio recordings of Marcus negotiating with these criminals. His voice was breathless, high-pitched, and trembling with poorly concealed panic. He aggressively leveraged the name of Apex Vanguard, treating my company like a magical shield. He promised the shadow lenders that he was less than 48 hours away from securing a massive $50 million institutional payout. He swore on his life that if they floated him a $2 million bridge loan to cover the extravagant costs of his signing gala and appease his furious contractors, he would repay them with 30% interest the very second the Apex Vanguard funds hit his corporate account. He was essentially placing a loaded gun directly to his own head. He was borrowing millions of dollars in violent street capital based entirely on a corporate contract that I was never going to sign. He took the predatory money and immediately began funneling it into the most absurdly lavish party preparations imaginable. He hired a Michelin-starred catering team. He ordered massive custom floral arrangements and secured a 10-piece string quartet. He was bleeding out from a severed artery and slapping an expensive designer bandage over the wound, hoping nobody would notice the growing red stain. The sheer crushing stress of his impending deadline was physically destroying him, but he refused to stop performing. On the afternoon before the scheduled signing event, I was sitting at my sleek glass desk reviewing the final deployment strategy with the federal agents assigned to Chloe's embezzlement case. The trap was perfectly set. The warrants were signed. The tactical teams were actively coordinating their entry points for the gala. Right in the middle of a briefing regarding the specific financial charges, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass desktop. The screen lit up, displaying a text message from Marcus. I held up a hand, signaling the federal agents to pause for a moment. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It was a long, rambling paragraph of pure, concentrated venom. Even through the digital text, I could feel the manic sweat and the desperate shaking of his hands as he typed the words. He was terrified that I was going to show up and puncture his delicate reality. The message was brutally direct. He told me that under absolutely no circumstances was I allowed to come anywhere near the event venue tomorrow night. He wrote that the gala was reserved strictly for high-net-worth individuals, legitimate business titans, and people who actually mattered to the local economy. He called me a bitter, ugly embarrassment, who would only drag down the sophisticated aesthetic of the evening. He explicitly ordered me to stay locked inside my cheap apartment with my slow child and watch my betters succeed from the sidelines. He typed that if I dared to show my face and ruin his ultimate triumph, he would personally have his private security team drag me out by my hair and throw me into the street like the trash I was. He ended the message by stating that tomorrow he was going to become a billionaire, and I was going to remain a pathetic, invisible failure for the rest of my miserable life. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, staring at the glowing screen. The sheer aggressive arrogance was staggering. He was drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, facing imminent violent retaliation from black market lenders, and completely unaware that his wife was a federal criminal. Yet his primary concern, his absolute driving focus in the final hours of his freedom, was making sure he successfully humiliated me one last time. He wanted to ensure I felt small and insignificant while he ascended to his imaginary throne. I did not feel a single flicker of anger. There was no hurt, no sorrow, no residual sibling affection left to damage. I looked up at the senior FBI agent sitting across the desk from me. He raised an eyebrow, silently asking if there was a problem with the operation. I shook my head slowly, a cold, razor-sharp smile forming on my lips. I looked back down at my phone and typed my response. I kept it incredibly brief, surgically precise, and entirely compliant. I typed out 3 simple words: "I understand, Marcus." I hit send and watched the message turn blue. It was the ultimate lie of omission. I fully understood his desperate need to exclude his failure of a sister. I understood his terror and his fragile ego. I would absolutely grant his wish. Nia, the quiet, submissive sister he had tormented for decades, would absolutely not be attending his grand celebration. She was dead and buried. The woman walking through the heavy brass doors of that luxury venue tomorrow night was the chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard. She was the architect of his total annihilation. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk, completely dismissing Marcus from my mind. I turned my full, undivided attention back to the federal agents waiting for my command. I calmly instructed them to proceed with the primary operation. I confirmed the exact time the luxury venue doors would open and detailed the precise moment the trap would spring shut. The stage was immaculately set. The actors were all blindly moving into their designated positions. Marcus had built his own perfect, flawless execution chamber, and tomorrow night, I was going to gladly pull the lever. The tires of my black armored SUV rolled to a silent halt on the polished cobblestone driveway of the Grand Heritage Hotel. If a camera were capturing my arrival, the lens would have locked into a smooth, relentless tracking shot, positioned just over my shoulder, following my every move as I stepped out of the vehicle. I wore a tailored crimson suit that cut a striking contrast against the dark evening sky, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. White-gloved valets rushed to pull open the massive, heavy brass doors of the hotel entrance. I did not pause or hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I walked with the fluid, undeniable power of an executioner, ascending the steps to the gallows. The muted hum of polite high society conversation and the soft, elegant notes of a live string quartet spilled out into the lobby, guiding me directly toward the grand ballroom. The venue was a grotesque monument to Marcus's sheer financial desperation. The $2 million he had recklessly borrowed from black market loan sharks was aggressively displayed in every single corner of the sprawling room. Towering arrangements of rare white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings. Massive hand-carved ice sculptures anchored the buffet stations where waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne and imported beluga caviar. It was a flawless counterfeit reality, meticulously designed to blind the city elite to the rotting foundation beneath their feet. At the far end of the room, Marcus and Chloe stood on a brightly lit elevated stage, soaking in the admiration of the crowd. Chloe wore a breathtaking silver couture gown that clung perfectly to her figure. Around her neck rested a heavy diamond pendant that sparkled blindingly under the crystal chandeliers. Looking at her dripping in stolen luxury, I felt a sharp spike of absolute disgust. I knew exactly how that dress and those diamonds had been funded. I could almost see the faces of the vulnerable elderly dementia patients, whose life savings she had ruthlessly drained just to stand on that stage and play the role of an old money aristocrat. She clung tightly to Marcus's arm, projecting the flawless image of a highly educated, deeply cultured wife, supporting her visionary billionaire husband. Marcus stood tall, his chest puffed out, gripping a crystal flute of champagne with a hand that I could see was trembling slightly from pure manic adrenaline. He was sweating despite the cool air conditioning of the ballroom. He was holding court with the most powerful elite in the entire region. The city mayor, the head zoning commissioners, and a dozen ultra-wealthy private investors from prominent old money families were seated at the VIP tables directly in front of the stage. These were people who valued honor, legacy, and flawless public reputations above all else. They were nodding along to Marcus's every word, completely captivated by his aggressive, charismatic performance. My mother Vivian was seated squarely in the center of the front row, wearing a brand new designer gown and weeping dramatic tears of absolute pride. She looked like a woman who believed she had finally conquered the world through the sheer brilliance of her golden child. I stood perfectly still in the shadows near the grand entrance, letting the tracking shot of my perspective take in the entire room. David, my lead investigator and the public face of Apex Vanguard for the evening, stepped confidently up to the crystal podium on the stage. He carried a thick, heavy leather-bound portfolio containing the $50 million disbursement contract. He adjusted the microphone and the room immediately quieted down. The string quartet stopped playing. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses ceased entirely. The ultra-rich investors turned their complete, undivided attention to the stage. Marcus looked like he was about to vibrate out of his own skin. He was mere seconds away from receiving what he believed to be his ultimate financial salvation. David welcomed the distinguished guests with a smooth, practiced corporate smile. He spoke eloquently about Apex Vanguard's deep commitment to urban development and our firm's legendary standard for absolute financial integrity. Every single word he spoke was laced with a lethal dual meaning that only he and I understood. He announced to the crowd that Apex Vanguard had thoroughly reviewed Marcus's luxury resort project. He stated clearly that the firm had conducted the most extensive, rigorous, and uncompromising background investigation in its entire corporate history. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, raising his glass to the crowd, completely missing the heavy trap hidden deep within David's words. Marcus took the microphone from David, eager to claim his moment of absolute glory. He delivered a sickeningly sweet speech, thanking his beautiful wife Chloe for bringing her family's generational wealth and aristocratic grace into his life. He publicly thanked our mother for raising a true visionary who refused to settle for mediocrity. He thanked the city officials for trusting his undeniable brilliance. He boldly declared that tonight marked the official birth of a billion-dollar real estate dynasty that would change the city's skyline forever. The ultra-rich investors raised their glasses high, toasting to a monumental partnership and a man they believed to be a financial titan. David stepped back to the podium and took the microphone gently from Marcus's hand. He announced to the breathless room that before the $50 million disbursement contract could be officially signed and executed, it required the physical presence and final authorization of the Apex Vanguard Chief Executive Officer. The room erupted into polite, eager applause. Marcus practically salivated, staring hungrily at the heavy double doors at the back of the room, waiting for a legendary Wall Street tycoon to walk through and hand him his empire. I stepped out of the shadows. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a sharp, commanding sound that instantly severed the polite applause. The crowd naturally parted, forming a wide, clear path straight down the center of the ballroom. I walked down the aisle with my head held high, my posture completely rigid, my eyes locked dead onto the stage. Marcus saw me first. The arrogant, triumphant smile instantly melted off his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His hand began to shake so violently, the expensive vintage champagne sloshed over the rim of his crystal flute and spilled directly onto his custom tuxedo shoes. He remembered his vicious text message. He remembered explicitly forbidding his ugly dropout sister from attending his gala. He remembered threatening to have me dragged out by my hair. Yet here I was, striding down the center aisle, bathed in the glowing light of the chandeliers, looking like I owned the entire building. Chloe noticed his sudden terror and followed his gaze, her flawless, aristocratic mask shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her jaw dropped open in absolute shock as she stared at the woman she had mercilessly humiliated for years. My mother stood up abruptly from her chair at the VIP table, her face contorted in furious disbelief. She opened her mouth, preparing to scream at me and demand that security drag me out of the room before I could ruin her golden boy's perfect night. Before my mother could utter a single syllable, David leaned into the microphone. His voice boomed across the silent, terrified room, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crashing into Marcus like a runaway freight train. David proudly introduced the sole founder, the primary shareholder, and the acting chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard. He said my full name loud and clear. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from Marcus's paralyzed hand. It hit the hardwood stage and shattered into pieces, the sharp sound echoing through the dead-silent ballroom. The trap had officially sprung shut. The droplets of expensive vintage liquor splattered across the highly polished stage surface, reflecting the bright overhead lights like shards of a broken mirror. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody in the grand ballroom breathed. The heavy silence was suffocating, thick with the rising panic of a man who had just realized he had handed his own throat to the executioner. Marcus stood completely frozen, his mouth slightly open, the aggressive magnetic charisma that had defined his performance all evening evaporating into thin air. His skin had turned a sickening ash-gray color, and beads of cold sweat began to form along his hairline, dripping down into his custom tuxedo collar. The high society guests, the prominent investors, and the zoning commissioners looked back and forth between Marcus's terrified face and my steady, unyielding approach. From a low-angle perspective, the camera tracked my every step as I closed the distance toward the stage. The crimson fabric of my power suit caught the light with an intimidating brilliance, making me look less like a family member and more like a descending monarch reclaiming stolen land. The hundreds of wealthy local elites stood like wax figures, their whispers completely dying out as the reality of David's words began to sink into their collective consciousness. Suddenly the spell broke. Vivian's face contorted from shocked confusion into a mask of pure, vicious outrage. She snapped her head toward Chloe, who was already trembling so violently her diamond necklace was clicking against her collarbone. Eager to protect her golden child and salvage the pristine narrative of the evening, Vivian marched handle directly into my path. Chloe followed close behind her, her silver couture gown rustling loudly against the marble floor as she attempted to project her usual condescending authority. They moved like a desperate wall of defense, entirely convinced that they could still intimidate me, still minimize me, and still kick me out of their exclusive world. Vivian stepped directly in front of me, her chest heaving with anger as she lowered her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper. She asked me how dare I show my face here after being explicitly forbidden from the event. She called me a disgusting, vindictive failure who was deliberately trying to humiliate her son in front of the city's most important business leaders. She reached out her manicured hand, intending to grab my arm and forcefully steer me toward the side exits before anyone else could witness the scene. Chloe chimed in right behind her, her voice dripping with artificial aristocratic pedigree, calling me a pathetic dropout who did not belong in a room full of actual wealth. I did not break my stride. I did not slow down, and I did not grant either of them the dignity of a single glance. I maintained absolute domain isolation, treating my mother and my sister-in-law as if they were completely invisible, nothing more than empty pockets of air in a room I brought under control entirely. When Vivian's hand came close to my sleeve, I simply adjusted my path by an inch, gliding past her with a cold, detached indifference that left her reaching for nothing. The low-angle camera tracked my face as I walked directly through their pathetic defense, leaving them standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, their mouths open in stunned humiliation as the crowd watched them get utterly dismissed. I climbed the wooden steps to the raised platform, the crisp, rhythmic click of my heels sounding like a steady countdown timer ticking away the final seconds of Marcus's fraudulent empire. As I reached the top of the stairs, the massive heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom were suddenly thrown completely open. The sharp thud echoed through the silent space, drawing every head in the room toward the entrance. Walking through the threshold was my chief legal advisor, holding a thick, encrypted corporate binder flanked tightly by Haidak Vu Lin Bang, sharply dressed wearing the unmistakable badges of the FBI. The federal agents moved with absolute tactical precision, stepping into the ballroom and quietly securing the perimeter exits. They did not say a word, but their presence turned the opulent country club ballroom into an official active law enforcement checkpoint. Marcus's eyes darted from me to the agents at the entrance, his chest heaving as a wave of pure primal terror completely overrode his baseline ego. He took an instinctive step backward, his legs hitting the edge of the display table behind him, almost knocked over the large vase. He looked desperately at the zoning commissioners, looking for any shred of the political protection he believed he had successfully bribed into existence. But the city officials were already pulling away from the stage, their expressions morphing into the cold, defensive detachment of career politicians avoiding a radioactive scandal. I walked straight to the center of the stage, stepping up to the crystal podium. David smoothly stepped aside, handing me the microphone with a respectful nod that solidified my absolute authority over the entire room. I adjusted the stand, the low-angle shot framing my silhouette against the vaulted ceilings, and the massive chandeliers capturing the complete visual transformation of the black sheep into the absolute ruler of the financial sector. The auditorium of hundreds of people went completely, firmly remained silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic, frantic breathing of my brother standing 2 feet to my right. The local real estate moguls, the old money heirs, and the politicians sat perfectly still, their eyes wide as they waited for the hammer to fall. They had spent the entire evening listening to Marcus brag about the ruthless, untouchable giant that was funding his project, and now they were finally realizing that the untouchable giant was the exact same woman he had discarded and disowned. I looked out over the crowd, my expression perfectly blank, completely devoid of any anger or malice. I looked down at the front row, where Vivian and Chloe were slowly turning around their faces, completely pale, as they realized that every single exit in the building was now blocked by federal enforcers. They had spent a lifetime trying to make me small, trying to script my behavior, and trying to use my silence as a resource for their own greed. But they had failed monumentally. The fake white aristocrat and the fake real estate mogul had locked themselves inside my trap, and I was finally ready to turn the key. I leaned into the microphone, letting my voice carry across the silent, captivated room, ready to deliver the final, devastating truth that would permanently dismantle their hollow world. The sharp, violent sound of shattering crystal served as the starting gun for his absolute destruction. A relentless, high-velocity camera push-in locked directly onto Marcus's face. The lens magnified every microscopic twitch of his facial muscles, capturing the exact fraction of a second his entire fabricated reality imploded. All the arrogant, triumphant blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, translucent white. His jaw hung slack, his vocal cords paralyzed by a terror so profound it defied basic human comprehension. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to pull him down to the jagged rocks below. I gripped the cool metal of the microphone stand, grounding myself in the absolute power of the moment. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I stared directly into the sea of horrified, ultra-wealthy investors and delivered the execution order. As the founder and CEO of Apex Vanguard, I officially declare I refuse the full $50 million disbursement for this project. The ensuing silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before the entire ballroom erupted into absolute unmitigated chaos. The wealthy investors in the VIP section shot out of their chairs as if the floor had suddenly caught fire. Elite zoning commissioners, men and women who had spent the entire evening sipping Marcus's stolen champagne, began frantically backing away from the stage, desperate to physically distance themselves from a man who was now a walking federal indictment. They pulled out their cell phones, barking frantic orders to their personal attorneys and crisis management teams. The illusion of the golden billionaire had evaporated, leaving behind the undeniable stench of a massive corporate scam. Marcus finally found his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched squeak that cracked over the ambient noise. He lunged toward the podium, extending a shaking hand toward the microphone. He begged the crowd to wait, stammering out a ridiculous, desperate lie that this was all a massive misunderstanding, a sick, twisted joke played by a jealous, estranged sister. He took one step too close to me. The 2 federal agents flanking the stage moved with terrifying speed. They stepped squarely between me and my brother, their hands resting ominously on their tactical belts. The lead agent issued a sharp, singular verbal warning that forced Marcus to freeze instantly, his hands raised in trembling surrender. I stepped around the agents, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. I informed the room that Marcus had not only forged my signature to secure his initial mezzanine debt, but he had also spent the last 48 hours securing $2 million in illegal black market loans from violent criminal syndicates to fund this very gala. I watched the remaining color drain from the faces of the city elite as they realized they were drinking champagne paid for by violent street predators. But I was not finished. The script required the complete eradication of the parasite as well. I turned my gaze down to the front row, locking eyes with Chloe. She was glued to her chair, her designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap prison uniform. I signaled David, who handed a thick, sealed evidentiary file directly to the lead FBI agent. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice echoing across the panicked room. I stripped away her aristocratic mask in front of the exact high society crowd she had spent years desperately trying to infiltrate. I detailed her intricate embezzlement ring. I explained how the flawless, highly educated heiress was actually a mid-level administrative assistant actively siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the retirement accounts of vulnerable elderly Alzheimer's patients. I announced that the extravagant diamond pendant currently resting against her collarbone and the massive deposit for this luxury venue were paid for by the stolen pension of a retired war veteran. The gasps from the elite crowd were audible, laced with pure, visceral disgust. The wealthy socialites she had desperately tried to impress were now staring at her like she was a diseased rat. The FBI agents did not wait another second. Two agents descended the stage stairs, moving with strict lethal efficiency. They approached Chloe, ordering her to stand. My mother, Vivian, finally broke her paralyzed silence, letting out a piercing, hysterical scream. She grabbed the agent's arm, demanding they stop, completely blinded by her delusional devotion to her golden family. The agent sharply reprimanded her, threatening her with immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. Vivian recoiled, stumbling backward into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Chloe offered no physical resistance, her body completely limp with shock. The sharp, metallic click of federal handcuffs echoed loudly, a sound far more satisfying than any string quartet. They marched her toward the exit, her silver couture gown dragging across the floor, her fake aristocratic legacy ending in a public, humiliating perp walk. On stage, the final remaining pillar of Marcus's ego completely buckled. The realization of his absolute, inescapable ruin crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He had no money. His wife was in federal custody. The FBI possessed all his fraudulent documents, and violent street lenders were actively waiting for a massive repayment he could never deliver. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood stage, landing directly in the puddle of his own spilled champagne and the shattered fragments of crystal. The man who had spent 3 decades tormenting me, the man who had texted me just yesterday to call me a pathetic, invisible failure, was now sobbing uncontrollably at my feet. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his custom midnight blue tuxedo ruined by the wet floor. He begged me for mercy. He pleaded with me to use Apex Vanguard's resources to pay off the shadow lenders, terrified for his physical safety. He offered to sign over everything he owned completely, forgetting he owned absolutely nothing. He reached out to grab the hem of my crimson suit, but a federal agent forcefully kicked his hand away, ordering him to stay on the ground. I looked down at him, my expression perfectly blank, completely devoid of a single ounce of empathy or regret. I leaned down slightly, ensuring only he could hear my final words over the chaos of the room. I reminded him of his text message. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing: this gala was strictly for high net worth individuals who actually mattered to the economy, which was exactly why he no longer belonged in the building. I informed him that the violent men he borrowed money from were likely already waiting in the parking lot, and Apex Vanguard was not in the business of paying off street-level debts for convicted fraudsters. I stood up, adjusting my tailored jacket with a smooth, deliberate motion. I turned away from the sobbing, broken shell of my brother and walked down the stage stairs. The camera tracked my exit from a low angle, capturing my unbothered stride as I moved through the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me a second time, not out of polite society rules, but out of sheer, unadulterated fear and profound respect. I walked straight past my mother, who was sobbing into her hands, completely shattered by the total destruction of her false idols. She reached out toward me, crying my name, but I did not stop. I did not even break my gaze. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The blinding red and blue strobe lights of arriving police cruisers washed over the cobblestone driveway, casting rhythmic shadows against the stone walls of the country club. Sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the absolute permanent end of Marcus's reign. The valets stood frozen in shock as the authorities swarmed the entrance. I walked smoothly to my waiting armored SUV, slipping into the quiet, leather-scented interior of the back seat. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the wreckage of my abusive family entirely behind me, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The war was officially over, and the quiet, peaceful silence of my victory was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But the execution was not complete until the entire city saw the undeniable physical proof. I set my crystal glass of sparkling water down into the cup holder and picked up the encrypted tactical tablet resting on the plush leather seat beside me. The high-definition live video feed from the ballroom security cameras displayed the absolute wreckage I had left behind. I tapped the secure communication link, connecting directly to David, who was still standing tall at the podium on the stage. I gave him the final, predetermined signal to initiate the digital slaughter. Inside the grand ballroom, the real show was just beginning. The opulent crystal chandeliers abruptly dimmed, plunging the sprawling venue into a dramatic, theater-like darkness. The sudden shift in lighting caused a fresh wave of panic to ripple through the wealthy attendees. Then the massive LED screen behind the stage flared to life with an aggressive, blinding intensity. Earlier in the evening, this exact screen had displayed Marcus's glamorous fabricated three-dimensional renderings of a luxury mega resort. Now it was repurposed into a giant digital guillotine. The camera direction demanded quick, aggressive whip pans darting relentlessly between the glaring light of the giant LED screen and the horrified reactions of the trapped crowd. The lens focused sharply on the screen as the first document slammed into view with a heavy digital thud that echoed through the high-fidelity sound system. It was Marcus's primary corporate bank statement. The camera whipped back to the VIP tables, capturing the widening eyes of the city zoning commissioner as he stared at the brightly highlighted red numbers. The balance was not just zero. It was a staggering, abysmal negative balance. The screen aggressively scrolled through months of confidential financial records, highlighting the frantic, desperate flow of black market money. Every single wire transfer from known violent criminal syndicates was circled in glowing neon yellow, complete with digital timestamps and the associated shadow shell company names. The camera panned sharply to a group of ultra-wealthy private investors. Their faces, previously glowing with aristocratic arrogance, were now twisted in pure visceral revulsion. They were looking at hard, undeniable proof that the man they had toasted just 30 minutes ago was not a visionary real estate developer, but a desperate, cornered rat drowning in illegal debt. Then the screen shifted, and the true depth of Marcus's depravity was exposed for the entire city to see. A new set of scanned documents populated the massive display. My heart turned to ice even as I watched from the isolated comfort of my vehicle. It was the original deed to Big Mama's land. The ancestral property that our grandmother had worked her entire life to secure, the sacred family land she had explicitly stated was never to be sold, developed, or leveraged. The camera pushed in extremely tight on the bottom right corner of the digital document, magnifying the signature line until it filled the entire 30-foot screen. The signature was a clumsy, shaking forgery. Marcus had actually forged our beloved grandmother's name to illegally pledge her generational land as collateral to ruthless, violent shadow lenders. A collective gasp of absolute disgust echoed through the ballroom, picked up clearly by the ambient microphones on the stage. The elite crowd was completely accustomed to corporate espionage and aggressive Wall Street business tactics, but stealing the home of an elderly family member crossed a severe moral line that even the most ruthless venture capitalists found entirely repulsive. The camera lens whipped violently back to Marcus. He was still huddled on the hardwood stage, his expensive custom tuxedo completely soaked in spilled champagne and his own cold sweat. The harsh, bright blue glow from the LED screen washed over his pale, terrified face, casting deep, grotesque shadows under his eyes. He looked completely feral, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the indisputable evidence of his felonies towered above him. He was no longer just a failed businessman suffering a public setback. He was a documented, irrefutable criminal fraudster whose entire existence had just been legally vaporized. David's voice boomed over the venue sound system, sharp and clinical, as he narrated the evidence scrolling across the screen. He detailed exactly how Marcus had systematically falsified regional appraisal reports, artificially inflated projected revenue margins, and entirely fabricated environmental impact studies to trick local government officials into granting expedited zoning permits. The camera panned to the city mayor, who was physically shielding his face, with his hand furiously whispering into his mobile phone, desperately trying to summon his crisis management team to save his political career from the radioactive fallout of Marcus's toxic scam. The visual assault on the screen accelerated without mercy. A sprawling complex web chart appeared connecting Marcus and Chloe directly to a dozen different fraudulent offshore shell corporations. It traced the exact path of the embezzled retirement funds Chloe had stolen, showing the bloody money flowing directly into Marcus's accounts to fund the massive deposit for this exact gala. They had literally paid for the imported caviar, the vintage champagne, and the rare white orchids using the stolen life savings of vulnerable dementia patients. They were not merely arrogant bullies making bad business decisions. They were calculated predatory criminals. The camera cut aggressively back to Vivian. My mother was slumped in her chair in the front row, her manicured hands covering her mouth. The flawless, designer-clad matriarch was physically shaking. The screen above her was broadcasting the undeniable truth that the golden son she had unconditionally worshipped, the boy she had chosen over me every single day of my entire life, was nothing more than a parasitic thief. All the years she had spent enabling his arrogance, covering up his catastrophic mistakes, and actively participating in the psychological abuse aimed at me, had culminated in this exact moment of catastrophic public humiliation. Her entire identity, completely intertwined with Marcus's fabricated success, was currently disintegrating in front of her high society peers. The wealthy country club women sitting at the adjacent tables were already leaning away from her, whispering viciously behind their hands. Marcus tried to push himself up off the wet floor, his movements slow and agonizingly clumsy. He raised a trembling hand, weakly gesturing toward the massive screen, as if he could physically wipe the damning documents away with his bare hands. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, mathematically impossible excuse to the crowd, but no words came out. The two federal agents standing near the podium stepped forward, their expressions completely devoid of human sympathy. They hauled Marcus to his feet with rough, unyielding efficiency. His legs were practically made of jelly, completely unable to support his own weight, as reality finally crushed his spine. The camera captured a tight, high-definition close-up of Marcus's wrists being forcefully pulled behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs locked into place with a sharp, definitive click that was picked up perfectly by the stage microphones. The sound echoed through the massive ballroom, a harsh metallic punctuation mark, signaling the absolute end of his life as a free man. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as the former billionaire was aggressively marched down the stage steps by federal law enforcement, his head hanging low in ultimate defeat. As I watched the final moments of the feed from the quiet sanctuary of my armored SUV, I felt a profound, settling calm wash through my veins. There was no rage left, no lingering resentment, no desire for further vengeance. The parasites who had fed on my insecurities and tried to destroy my future were now permanently excised from society. The evidence was secured, the federal indictments were absolutely guaranteed, and Big Mama's land was safely protected under the massive, impenetrable legal umbrella of Apex Vanguard. I turned off the tablet screen, plunging the back of the SUV into darkness. I instructed my driver to head toward the private aviation terminal. It was time to return to my real life, to the massive global empire I had built with my own hands, far away from the toxic, shattered remnants of a family that had finally received exactly what they deserved. The city skyline blurred past the tinted windows, and I leaned back against the leather headrest, savoring the crisp, clean taste of absolute, uncompromising justice. The quiet, peaceful silence of my victory was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I leaned back against the plush leather seat of my armored vehicle as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. I picked up my encrypted tactical tablet from the center console. The live security feeds from the country club were still actively broadcasting the total destruction of Marcus and his associates. But there was one specific piece of footage I needed to review. I needed to witness the exact moment the final nail was driven into the coffin. I tapped the screen and rewound the security feed to the chaotic minutes just before the federal agents had dragged Chloe out of the building in handcuffs. I had not stopped my campaign of destruction with Marcus. I had ensured that Chloe experienced her own personalized absolute social execution. The security camera feed on my tablet tilted wildly as the automated lens tracked the sudden, aggressive movements in the ballroom. The system switched to a severe Dutch angle, perfectly capturing the nauseating, disorienting reality of a world that was rapidly collapsing. From this skewed, slanted perspective, the opulent ballroom looked like a sinking ship. The crystal chandeliers hung at sharp, unnatural angles, casting harsh, jagged shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. In the center of this tilted frame stood Chloe. Before the FBI had officially taken her into custody, she had desperately tried to flee the stage to seek refuge at a specific VIP table located near the front of the room. This table was entirely occupied by the Sterling family. They were the absolute apex of the city-white elite old money billionaires whose generational wealth completely dwarfed the pathetic loans Marcus had scrounged together. Seated at the head of the table was Eleanor Sterling, a formidable, untouchable matriarch with icy blue eyes and a posture of absolute authority. Next to her sat her son William Sterling. William was Chloe's actual secret prize. While projecting the image of a supportive partner to Marcus, she had been simultaneously running a highly calculated, secretive secondary grift. She had manipulated William into a clandestine engagement, fully intending to discard Marcus the moment the Sterling family fortune was secured. The Dutch angle camera shot zoomed in on Chloe as she reached the Sterling table. She was hyperventilating, her pristine silver couture gown shaking as she tried to grab William's arm. She attempted to put on her best aristocratic victim face, pleading with William to get her out of the room, claiming that the federal raid was a massive misunderstanding and a vicious lie. William looked confused, torn between his affection for her and the horrifying reality playing out on the giant LED screens above the stage. That was the exact moment I intercepted her. In the video playback, I watched myself descend the stage stairs and walk directly toward the Sterling table. The crowd naturally backed away, treating me like a dangerous, unpredictable element. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I moved with the cold, predatory calm of a shark approaching cornered prey. I stopped directly across the table from Eleanor Sterling. Chloe froze completely, her hand still resting on William's arm. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrified ghost trapped in the tilted camera frame. I did not offer polite introductions. I simply raised my right hand and slammed a thick, heavy, leather-bound file directly onto the pristine white tablecloth. The sharp thud echoed loudly over the ambient panic of the room. I looked directly into Eleanor Sterling's eyes and informed her that before she welcomed a new daughter-in-law into her prestigious family, she might want to review the mandatory background check Apex Vanguard had conducted on her son's future wife. Eleanor Sterling did not flinch. She picked up her gold-rimmed reading glasses from the table, placed them carefully on the bridge of her nose, and opened the file. The camera angle captured the absolute terror radiating from Chloe. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She knew exactly what was inside that folder. It was not just the embezzlement records regarding the Alzheimer patients that David had announced on the stage. It was the complete, unfiltered history of her deeply pathetic criminal existence. I watched the security feed as Eleanor Sterling flipped through the pages, her icy blue eyes scanning the highlighted documents. I had provided the Sterling family with undeniable proof of massive systemic credit card fraud. The file contained dozens of bank statements detailing how Chloe had stolen the identities of her former roommates, her college classmates, and even her own distant relatives. She had opened multiple fraudulent accounts, maximizing the credit limits to purchase the designer shoes, the imported handbags, and the luxury cosmetics she used to craft her fake aristocratic persona. The documents proved that her supposedly wealthy European family background was a complete fabrication. She was not old money. She was a common desperate thief drowning in thousands of dollars of synthetic debt. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried over the table. I informed the Sterling family that the silver couture gown Chloe was currently wearing had been purchased using a stolen platinum credit card registered to a deceased woman in Ohio. I stated that her entire existence was a carefully constructed criminal enterprise designed to extract wealth from anyone gullible enough to believe her flawless, sophisticated act. William Sterling stood up from his chair looking at Chloe as if she had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. He backed away, brushing her hand off his arm, with a look of pure visceral revulsion. He asked her if any of it was true. Chloe tried to step toward him, tears ruining her expensive makeup, her voice cracking as she begged him to listen to her. She swore she loved him and claimed the documents were forged. But Eleanor Sterling had heard enough. The matriarch of the Sterling family stood up slowly, her presence commanding absolute obedience. The Dutch angle of the camera made her look like a towering figure of divine judgment looking down upon a worthless insect. She did not yell, she did not lose her temper. She simply extended her hand across the table and grabbed Chloe's left wrist with a sudden shocking physical force. Chloe gasped in pain, trying instinctively to pull her arm back, but Eleanor's grip was like a steel vise. On Chloe's ring finger sat a massive, flawless, 5-carat diamond engagement ring. It was a priceless Sterling family heirloom passed down through 4 generations of aristocratic wealth. Eleanor looked Chloe dead in the eyes, her expression radiating pure aristocratic disgust. She told Chloe that she was a filthy, parasitic thief who was entirely unfit to stand in the same room as her family, let alone wear their generational crest. With one sharp, violent motion, Eleanor Sterling physically ripped the diamond ring off Chloe's finger. The force of the snatch was so aggressive it left a bright red friction burn across Chloe's skin. Chloe cried out in physical pain, clutching her bare hand to her chest, her entire body shaking with the absolute humiliation of being publicly stripped of her ultimate prize. Eleanor dropped the heavy diamond ring into her own designer purse and turned her back on Chloe, completely dismissing her existence. She looked at her son and issued a single sharp command, ordering William to leave the building immediately. The white elite family gathered their coats and walked away from the table, leaving Chloe standing entirely alone in the center of the ballroom, completely exposed and utterly destroyed. It was only then, after the Sterling family had completely discarded her, and her entire future had been violently snatched from her hand, that the 2 federal agents had approached her. The video feed showed them stepping up behind her, grabbing her arms and locking the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. Her knees buckled, and they had to physically drag her toward the exit, her expensive stolen gown sweeping across the dirty marble floor. I tapped the screen of my tablet, stopping the video playback. The harsh blue light of the screen faded, leaving the back of my armored vehicle in comfortable darkness. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the smooth vibration of the SUV as it carried me back to my headquarters. Marcus was facing decades in federal prison for massive corporate fraud and the illegal exploitation of our grandmother legacy. Chloe had been publicly unmasked as a fraudulent thief, stripped of her multi-million-dollar engagement and handed directly over to the FBI. Vivian had been forced to watch her entire delusional reality collapse into ash. I looked out the window at the passing city. The heavy, suffocating chains of my past had finally been shattered. I had not just survived their cruelty, I had weaponized it, returning every single ounce of their malice with overwhelming calculated force. The execution was perfect, and my empire was completely secure. I kept my eyes locked on the encrypted tactical tablet resting on my lap, as my armored vehicle glided silently through the dark city streets. The automated security feed from the ballroom abruptly split into multiple grids, integrating the live, erratic video streams from the federal agents' tactical body cameras. The smooth cinematic angles of the ballroom were instantly replaced by a chaotic, handheld perspective. The footage jerked and violently shook with every sudden movement, perfectly capturing the raw, unpolished destruction of a fabricated dynasty. It was a visceral, suffocating view of the exact moment the illusion of family loyalty completely evaporated. On the screen, the lead FBI agents firmly grabbed Marcus by his soaked tuxedo jacket, violently hoisting his limp body off the champagne-drenched stage. His custom leather shoes slipped clumsily against the shattered crystal. The heavy steel handcuffs bit deep into his wrists. Seeing her golden child physically restrained finally broke the very last thread of Vivian's sanity. She did not rush to comfort him. She did not offer a mother's unconditional support. Instead, she violently pivoted, searching frantically for a scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic shame crashing down upon her. Her manicured finger snapped out like a whip, pointing directly at Chloe, who was currently being dragged toward the main exit by two other agents. Vivian lunged forward, her expensive designer heels snapping against the floor. The refined, soft-spoken matriarch vanished entirely, replaced by a feral, cornered animal. She unleashed a torrential scream that caused the remaining high society guests to physically recoil. She blamed Chloe for everything. Vivian shrieked that Chloe was a parasitic gold digger, a filthy common thief who had deliberately manipulated her brilliant, innocent son. She screamed that Chloe had polluted their pristine family name, actively ignoring the undeniable fact that their family name had been entirely built on Marcus's blatant, long-standing fraud. Chloe heard the vicious accusations and abruptly stopped fighting the agents dragging her. A dark, ugly realization washed over her pale face. There would be no high-priced lawyers riding to her rescue. There would be no sterling family bailout. She was going to federal prison, and her beloved mother-in-law was actively trying to ensure she took the absolute heaviest sentence. The aristocratic facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. Chloe transformed instantly from a weeping socialite into a vicious, cornered predator. Using a sudden burst of adrenaline, Chloe twisted her body violently, breaking free from the agent's grip for one singular, chaotic fraction of a second. The body camera footage jerked wildly as she lunged straight past Vivian and threw herself directly at Marcus. She did not aim for a hug. She aimed for his face. Her acrylic nails dug ruthlessly into his cheek, scratching deep red lines across his skin before the agents could tackle her backward. Chloe's voice cracked into a hysterical, agonizing shriek. She completely abandoned the soft, cultured accent she had spent years perfecting. She screamed that Marcus was a pathetic, incompetent failure who could not even secure a legitimate bank loan without forging his own grandmother's signature. She yelled to the federal agents, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, confessing that Marcus had explicitly ordered her to siphon the retirement funds. She claimed he was the ultimate mastermind, that he had emotionally blackmailed her into stealing the Alzheimer's patient's money because his luxury resort project was bleeding cash before the foundation was even poured. She actively offered to testify against him, desperately throwing the man she had sworn to love directly into the line of federal fire. Marcus did not take the betrayal quietly. The moment Chloe's nails left his face, the last ounce of his manufactured billionaire stoicism completely dissolved. He began thrashing against the agents holding him, spitting pure venom back at his wife. He completely abandoned his entire narrative of the brilliant self-made titan. He screamed that he knew absolutely nothing about the stolen pensions. He loudly declared that Chloe was a compulsive, pathological liar who had independently orchestrated the massive credit card fraud to fund her own sick obsession with luxury couture. He begged the agents to check the financial records, insisting she had hidden the stolen money in offshore accounts he never had access to. Vivian threw herself back into the fray, her pristine updo unraveling as strands of hair fell wildly across her face. Her heavy diamond earrings swung violently as she threw her fists toward Chloe. She called her a diseased rat, a wretched criminal who had ruined her perfect son. She completely ignored the giant LED screen, still blazing with the undeniable proof of Marcus's own illegal black market loans. In Vivian's deeply fractured mind, Marcus was entirely pure, a tragic victim of an evil woman's manipulation. The three of them collapsed into a pathetic, screaming triad of mutual destruction. They viciously tore at each other's ragged clothes, actively exposing every single dirty secret, every hidden lie, and every ounce of their shared moral rot. They were behaving exactly like starving rabid dogs, fighting over a meatless bone in a dark alleyway. The ultra-wealthy guests, the elite politicians, and the powerful zoning commissioners who had not yet fled the building were no longer backing away in fear. They were standing perfectly still, holding up their mobile phones, recording every agonizing second of the humiliating spectacle. The social execution was absolute. The federal agents rapidly lost their patience with the chaotic domestic dispute. A sharp, booming command cut through the screaming. The tactical teams moved with brutal, overwhelming force. Two agents grabbed Vivian by her shoulders, physically lifting her off the ground and shoving her backward into a display table. The table tipped over, sending a towering arrangement of rare white orchids crashing to the floor, burying Vivian under a pile of broken glass, spilled water, and crushed petals. Simultaneously, the agents holding Marcus slammed him aggressively face first against a marble pillar. The sickening thud of his skull hitting the cold stone instantly silenced his pathetic whining. An agent pressed a heavy tactical boot against the back of his knee, forcing him to remain absolutely motionless while they thoroughly searched his pockets for any concealed weapons or secondary cell phones. Marcus whimpered softly, a broken, defeated sound that signaled the complete evaporation of his manhood. Chloe was violently wrestled to the floor. An agent planted his knee firmly between her shoulder blades, pressing her face directly into the sticky champagne-soaked hardwood of the stage. Her silver couture gown, stained with spilled liquor and dirt, rode up awkwardly around her thighs. She thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities that no true aristocrat would ever utter, until the agent sharply warned her that any further resistance would result in a secondary charge of assaulting a federal officer. She instantly went limp, sobbing uncontrollably, into a puddle of ruined luxury. I sat in the dark, silent comfort of my vehicle, watching the erratic body camera feed capture the final pathetic remnants of their dignity. There was absolutely no loyalty among thieves. The moment their fabricated wealth was stripped away, the moment the heavy hand of real consequence touched their shoulders, their fake love completely shattered. They did not unite to face the storm. They actively attempted to drown each other, just to steal one more breath of air. I reached out and pressed the power button on the encrypted tablet. The screen went completely black, severing the live feed and plunging the interior of my SUV back into total darkness. The grotesque noise of their screaming, the sharp commands of the federal agents, and the frantic clicking of the high society cameras were instantly gone. I closed my eyes and let the smooth, rhythmic motion of the tires rolling over the asphalt lull me into a state of profound peace. I had not just defeated them, I had forced them to display their true repulsive nature to the entire world. I had exposed them as nothing more than feral animals dressed in stolen luxury. The heavy, suffocating shadow they had cast over my entire life was permanently eradicated. The road ahead of me was entirely clear, and for the very first time in my existence, I was driving completely free. My driver suddenly slammed on the brakes. The heavy armored SUV jerked to a violent halt, throwing me slightly forward against my seatbelt. I opened my eyes, the quiet sanctuary of my departure, instantly shattered. "What is it?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm over the intercom. "Someone threw themselves directly in front of the vehicle, Ms. Nia," my driver replied, his tone laced with professional, cautious concern. "It is your mother." I looked through the reinforced glass windshield. Bathed in the blinding, unforgiving glare of my high beams and the chaotic red and blue strobes of the surrounding police cruisers, Vivian was standing dead center in the path of my exit. She looked like a ghost trapped in a violently collapsing nightmare. Her immaculate, carefully sculpted updo was completely ruined, with wet, matted strands of hair plastered wildly across her face. Her expensive designer gown was torn from her physical altercation with Chloe, and dark stains marred the fabric. She was frantically waving her arms, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying desperation. I could have easily instructed the driver to reverse and find an alternate gate. I could have rolled up the privacy partition and ignored her existence entirely. But the script of this evening required absolute, definitive closure. I needed to sever this final rotting thread with my own two hands. I pushed open the heavy door of the SUV and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The cobblestone driveway was slick with the damp chill of the evening. As soon as my custom Italian leather shoes touched the ground, Vivian let out a strangled, breathless cry. She stumbled toward me, practically crawling over the wet, hard pavement. The camera angle shifted, positioning itself perfectly over my right shoulder, looking down to capture the stark, undeniable hierarchy of the moment. I stood tall and unyielding, my tailored crimson suit, a sharp, vibrant slash of absolute power against the dark night. Vivian, the woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me, crashed violently to her knees directly at my feet. Her manicured hands, trembling uncontrollably, shot out and clamped onto the fabric of my trousers. She gripped the hem with a white-knuckled intensity, her acrylic nails digging desperately into the expensive wool. She looked up at me, her face completely ravaged by tears, her heavy mascara running in dark, ugly rivers down her pale cheeks. The aristocratic, untouchable matriarch was entirely gone. In her place was a broken, pathetic shell of a woman begging for salvation from the daughter she had thrown away. "Nia!" she wailed, her voice cracking, completely unrecognizable from the cultured, soft-spoken tone she used at her elite country club luncheons. "Nia, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it is a massive mistake." I stared down at her, my expression perfectly blank. I did not try to pull my leg away. I let her cling to me, forcing her to feel the absolute crushing futility of her actions. "Tell who exactly?" I asked, my voice slicing effortlessly through the ambient noise of the wailing sirens. "The FBI, the Shadowlenders, the elderly victims Chloe robbed. The execution is over, Vivian. The verdict is final." "No!" she screamed, shaking her head violently. She tugged at my suit, her grip tightening in pure, visceral desperation. "He is your biological brother. Nia, please. He is your own flesh and blood. You grew up together. You share the exact same parents. You cannot do this to your own family. I am begging you, as your mother, please, show him some mercy. Use your company, use your money, buy him out of this. You have the power to save him." I listened to her pathetic, hysterical pleas, analyzing every single word. She was invoking flesh and blood. She was weaponizing the sacred concept of family. It was the ultimate sickening hypocrisy. Where was this profound dedication to flesh and blood when they were systematically destroying my confidence? Where was this biological loyalty when Marcus forged Big Mama's signature to illegally leverage our generational land? Where was her maternal instinct when she actively participated in making me feel like an invisible, worthless burden in my own childhood home? She did not care about family. She only cared about Marcus because he was the shiny, golden reflection of her own inflated ego. If Marcus went to federal prison, Vivian's identity as the mother of a billionaire prodigy went with him. She was not begging for his life. She was begging for her own social survival. I slowly leaned forward, breaking the physical distance between us. The camera remained locked over my shoulder, framing Vivian's terrified, tear-streaked face as my shadow fell completely over her. I looked directly into her eyes, ensuring she could see the absolute terrifying void where my empathy for her used to reside. "Flesh and blood," I repeated softly, letting the words roll off my tongue with cold, calculated precision. "That is a fascinating concept. I seem to remember a very specific conversation we had in my bedroom 5 years ago. I came to you for help. I asked you for a fraction of the support you endlessly poured into Marcus. Do you remember what you told me?" Vivian froze, her sobbing catching abruptly in her throat. Her eyes widened as the memory visibly crashed into her consciousness, paralyzing her vocal cords. I did not wait for her to formulate a lie. I leaned in an inch closer, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that was sharp enough to draw blood. I returned the exact verbatim quote she had used to casually shatter my heart all those years ago. "This is only for people with a future, Mom. Prison food is what suits him right now." The words struck her with the physical force of a sledgehammer. Vivian recoiled instantly as if she had been burned by fire. Her hands let go of my crimson trousers. She slumped backward onto the wet cobblestones, her mouth hanging open in silent, absolute horror. The realization of her irreversible failure locked her in a state of catatonic shock. She finally understood that the daughter she had starved of affection had grown into a predator who fed on retribution. There was no mercy left to harvest. The well was completely, permanently dry. I slowly stood back up to my full height, smoothing the slight wrinkles from the fabric of my trousers with a casual, unbothered swipe of my hand. I looked past her, casting my gaze across the chaotic parking lot. A few yards away, the federal agents were forcefully shoving a handcuffed, sobbing Marcus into the back of an armored transport van. Chloe was already locked inside another vehicle, screaming hysterically against the reinforced glass. The Golden Dynasty was completely eradicated. The empire of lies was reduced to an active crime scene. I turned my back on the woman who birthed me. I did not say another word. I stepped back into the quiet, leather-scented sanctuary of my SUV and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing out the noise, the flashing strobe lights, and the pathetic broken sobbing of a mother who had bet everything on the wrong child. "Take me home," I told the driver. The massive engine purred to life. The vehicle smoothly accelerated, gliding effortlessly past Vivian's collapsed form on the pavement. I did not look out the window. I did not check the rearview mirror. I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The war was officially over. The battlefield was cleared. And the future, the brilliant, untouchable future, they had sworn I would never have belonged entirely to me. The dark, quiet interior of the armored SUV dissolved into the bright, sunlit warmth of my living room. A slow, steady camera pullout revealed the space bathed in radiant golden light. The heavy, suffocating shadows of that night were completely gone, replaced by the vibrant reality of the life I had built. I stood by the large bay windows, looking out over the manicured lawns of my estate, reflecting on the absolute permanence of my victory. The aftermath played out exactly as I had orchestrated. Marcus did not talk his way out of federal court. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison without the possibility of early parole. Chloe lost every stolen dime and her fabricated aristocratic title. She is currently working double shifts as a diner waitress on the outskirts of the city, permanently shunned and blacklisted by the very high society she sacrificed her soul to infiltrate. Vivian was evicted from her sprawling mansion when the government seized all of Marcus's fraudulent assets. She was forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated apartment in the absolute worst district of the city, completely isolated with nothing but her shattered pride. As for Big Mama's land, I easily bought back the deed through Apex Vanguard. Instead of a sterile luxury resort for the elite, our generational property is now a state-of-the-art community center, providing free educational support and resources for underprivileged youth. The heavy oak doors of the living room suddenly swung open. My son Jamal sprinted into the room. The boy my mother had callously dismissed as an invisible burden, the child she swore had absolutely no future, was glowing with pure, unfiltered triumph. He held a massive, glittering gold trophy high above his head, the undisputed champion of the state youth programming decathlon. He crashed into my legs, laughing with an infectious, absolute joy. I knelt down and wrapped my arms tightly around him, anchoring myself in the only family that actually mattered. I looked up over his shoulder, locking eyes directly with the slowly retreating camera lens. I offered a genuine, peaceful smile. They tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds. The screen slowly fades to absolute black.